Good afternoon, everybody. Let's see, it's about 12:16, so maybe we should get started. Thank you all for coming to Chicago's Best Ideas. It's a lot of fun to be part of this. This is really a continuation of a great program that began some years ago during the law school's centennial celebration. We have to thank Professor Levmore, then Dean Levmore, for inaugurating this program. And it was really an opportunity to share with our students, especially, some of the greatest ideas that have emerged from the law school. And it's been a great tradition that's continued on since then. We've had a number of faculty over time share the current work that they were doing, the next generation of Chicago's best ideas. And this past year, several faculty have kind of gone back to some of the original sort of motivations for it, which is to not speak about their own ideas, but to speak about someone else's ideas. So I'm giving a talk today that's in that spirit and in that tradition. I'm not talking about my own scholarship. I'm talking about another idea that I think is really one of the great ideas that have emerged from the university. And that's also something that I'm doing, which is a little bit different maybe than some of the past talks, is that I'm going to talk about an idea that didn't emerge from the law school. It emerged from another department of the university, but the case I want to make to you today is that it has great interest and application for a variety of issues that we as lawyers are interested in. I'm not doing anything so crazy as picking one of the great ideas that have emerged from the university in physics or chemistry. Instead, I'm talking about one that emerged from the economics department. And again, hope to also, I really would like to think that this is an idea that maybe should have wider appreciation in law. It has some appreciation, but I think maybe it should have more, and maybe it will inspire others to think about these ideas. So what I'm talking about today is the idea of the economics of superstars. So this is an idea that emerged from Professor Sherwin Rosen in the Department of Economics. And let me talk just a little bit to give you a sort of biographical sketch of who he was. He was both a graduate of the university and a longtime faculty member here. He obtained his PhD in economics in 1966, and then began his teaching career at the University of Rochester, came back to Chicago, joined the faculty of the economics department. He eventually became chair of the department, and he was the Bergman Distinguished Service Professor in economics. He was primarily a labor economist. And what do I mean by that? I mean that he studied and he did scholarship on how job markets function. What are the interactions between employers and workers? He was really prominent in this. He was a longtime editor of the Journal of Labor Economics and then the Journal of Political Economy. He became president of the Society of Labor Economists, and shortly before his death, the president of the American Economics Association. I think in many ways, the topics that he chose were ahead of his time, which is why I wanted to revisit one of them. In particular, a lot of his work focused on the distribution of earnings. So, of course, today, economic inequality is a really much discussed and debated topic. And I think he was ahead of his time in paying attention to that distribution of earnings. The other feature that I think is interesting that makes his work particularly relevant for us that are interested in law is that he didn't just focus on relationships between employers and employees sort of in the broad abstract. Instead, he tried to integrate ideas of institutions. He drew a lot on industrial organization in his work. And that, I think, has particular relevance for us. His approach to a problem was often to come at it from a direction that no one else had thought about, no one else had anticipated. And yet it had a nice linkage of looking at the real world and then using economic tools. So I hope to convey some of that today. I had several classes with him. He had a really irreverent sense of humor. Some of his comments I remember really clearly. And it was a really great person to take a class from. He produced a number of great ideas that I could have chosen from. He wrote a really famous paper on the market for lawyers, which I think is still worth reading today. He had really clever ideas about the dynamics of how committees work and about how people are paid, rather than just being paid by the hour or paid on a piece rate, or people paid through other means, tournaments and so forth. But the one I want to focus on today is this idea of superstars. So here's the motivation for superstars. In some kinds of activities, what we observe is a concentration of output or service provision that's really concentrated among a very small number of individuals. And moreover, those people that control or serve a large part of that market often earn outsized financial rewards. And so what this means is that there's often a skew or a skewness in that distribution of earnings. It doesn't look like the bell curves that we're all normally familiar with. So here's a few kind of motivating examples. One motivating example is think about professional comedians. How many are there in the United States? A few hundred, few thousand, not that many. Many amateurs probably, but many not full-time. And yet those that appear on televisions and movies, they earn outsized rewards relative to the rest of comedians. Or think about classical music. Again, like a relatively small number of people are full-time in classical music, probably a lot of amateurs. But then there are those people who are really famous within classical music, and they earn really outsized rewards. Now, another feature of classical music is whether the layperson can really tell the difference between the person who is the superstar performer who earns the outside rewards and the person that we see, at our local recital. Then we might see someone at a local recital, like, they are so good. How are they not a star? And it's hard for us to distinguish those fine differences in talent. So how to describe this? So a couple of patterns here that we're talking about. I guess a close connection between the size of the audience and the magnitude of the personal rewards, or the size of the market and the magnitude of the personal rewards. And a tendency of intense competition. Those with slight improvements in talent earn this outsized reward. So to say this kind of more formally or more precisely, we can imagine that there's an index of talent, and that talent then produces or generates revenue. And we think about what's the relationship between the talent and the revenue. We would expect that as talent increases, the revenue would increase. But what's the relationship? Is it perfectly proportional? Does someone who's twice as talented as someone else earn twice as much money? No, I think when we're talking about superstars, we're talking about a disproportionate relationship. We're talking about someone who earns maybe 5 times as much, or maybe 10 times as much as the person who's next talented to them. And so one formal way of saying that is that the earnings of talent are convex. They're increasing more than proportionately when talent improves. So one implication of this then is, what does the distribution of earnings look like? And what it means is small differences in talent get magnified into even bigger differences in earnings. In the farther we go down the top of the scale of talent, the bigger the differences. And so we think about this as another way to describe this is, it's an activity or an occupation or an industry in which there are a few people at the very top earning much, much more than other people, a long right tail in the distribution. So those are the kind of the patterns we observe in markets that we think about, or activities that we think about are characterized by superstars. And so Rosen's contribution is to try to identify what are the features that produce these kinds of patterns or produce these kinds of outcomes. In other words, when should we expect to see these kinds of outcomes being generated? And he comes up with 2 features of these kinds of activities or these kinds of markets that generate these sorts of outcomes. So first, focus on what we as consumers want. What's the nature of our consumption in these kinds of activities? What are the nature of consumer tastes? And here, his point is that the activity is such that there's an imperfect substitution among different types of talent. Somebody who's a poor talent is not a good substitute for somebody else who has better talent. I mean, just think about it. We would rather hear one singer who has superior talent than to hear 2 singers who are twice as bad, right? We would much rather have that kind of talent. Now, what does that mean? I mean, that means also that in other types of settings, we would be willing to pay more in order to receive the person of superior talent. Think about a situation where we have a serious illness, we have to go to a surgeon. That surgeon we would be willing to pay more to get to the better surgeon. Or to draw an example from law, think about a corporation that had a large case it was facing with large damages. Wouldn't they be willing to pay more to get a lawyer who has greater talent? And notice that this is really different than most kinds of employment relationships. In most kinds of employment relationships, one worker is just about as good as another. We could, imagine that the work that they do is not perfectly substitutable, but it's close enough. And so we would just pay those workers probably by the hour. Or in some work settings, we'd have people who their output is the product itself. How many widgets do they produce? And in that setting, we could just pay them a piece rate. We can pay them by the number of widgets because one widget's just like another. But here we really see differences in talent, and we're willing to pay a premium for higher talent. And that contributes to the skewness in earnings. So that's one kind of observation that Rosen has about markets that are characterized by superstars. Here's another one. And this one is about that one was about kind of our consumer tastes. And the second one is about the production side. And it's really about what we might call the technology of production. And that is in these markets where we see superstars, what the performer can do is they can almost duplicate or clone themselves. In other words, they can produce another unit for consumers at almost no cost. Whatever the performer has to do to be on stage to deliver their performance, it's almost the same whether it's 10 people in the audience or 1,000. Once the author has written the book, it's almost nothing to sell one more copy. And this is another way of saying that the consumption here is almost non-rival. Something that's rivalrous, if I go to a restaurant and eat a meal, it prevents someone else from eating it. But here, to sell another seat, to have one more listener to the performance, one more observer to the performance, it doesn't impinge on someone else's enjoyment of the performance in most circumstances, right? And so this also contributes to the ability to reach a kind of a large amount of the audience. And in fact, the performer or the service provider can deliver to an enormous number of people simultaneously. So now, okay, so let's put these two sides of these two observations together. And what does it tell us about what's the outcome in this market going to be? So on the one hand, we've got consumer preferences that really have a strong preference for additional talent. On the other hand, we know something about the technology that we can provide the service to a large number of potential purchasers without much increase in the additional cost. And so when we put these two things together, then we can see that the person of superior talent can really capture so much of the market because consumers want that person's services and the technology allows them to provide it. Now, even if the return on each one of those purchases or those sales of the performer's talent is very small, the aggregate revenue could be very large if they serve a large number of people. But moreover, also remember what we said about preferences. The highly talented person can arguably charge more than what the less talented person can charge without losing any customers because of that strong preference to really consume the very best. So you can imagine now we've got a kind of formal way of thinking about this. Here's the thing that's remarkable about this. Rosen writes this article publishes it in 1981. And so it was published in the American Economic Review. And if you want to go read it, I encourage you to do so. It's highly mathematical. This is typical of kind of modern economics. But if you'd like a non-technical version, he published a non-technical version in 1983 in the American Scholar. And that one is, I think, a really great read. And I think you get all of the ideas without getting bogged down in the technical parts of it. But what's so interesting is that when we now think about what Rosen was describing, both on the consumer side and then especially on the technology side, we think so much of the technological innovations we've seen in recent years. But again, he publishes this in 1981. In 1981, this was long before, so much of the technology that we have today, before the internet, before smartphones, certainly, before cell phones. at a time when really the motivational examples that he was presenting were really about the move from live performance to recorded performance on film or television, or about the move from live performance to phonographs, right? But yet we see that the same dynamic that he described there is accelerated with the technological innovations that we've enjoyed, in recent years. So one other couple of implications to draw out of this, and then what I want to do is I want to move on to talk about a couple of applications. And with regard to the implications of this, notice that what the technology and the technological innovations, the digitization that we've experienced in recent years, allows the performer to do, it reduces their communications costs, reduces their transportation costs. It allows them to take advantage of a larger, economy of scale. And therefore, when we see that, we should see even greater skewness and even greater acceleration in income. You notice something else here that's actually also very interesting is that I think there are embedded in Rosen's ideas notions about law that are not explicit. And here I'll just mention two. So one is that when he thinks about expanding the size of the market through a wider technology, really what he's talking about is the reach of intellectual property law. He's really saying that a robust intellectual property regime allows the performer to exercise a property right over all of the consumers of their performance. And notice it's unstated in his modeling and in his framework that that ability to exclude potential buyers is really important, right? That's what allows the superstar to capture the returns to their performance. If they're unable to exclude people, then they're not going to get those outsized rewards. That seems really crucial. And in recent years, we've seen a great deal of concern about piracy and theft of intellectual property. And notice then we can see then through this Rosen framework a real connection between the growth and establishment of superstars and the intellectual property protections. The other thing that I'll note here, because I think it comes up in some subsequent applications to Rosen, is just antitrust law. I think he mentions it in one sentence, just kind of passing, like it basically says, oh, it doesn't apply here. And it doesn't apply because we're talking about individuals of superior talent. And given what we said about preferences, there's no perfect substitute for them. They really are different, right? How could we bring an antitrust action when we're recognizing that the service that they provide is different from anyone else's? In what sense would that really be monopolization? So, okay, so that's kind of sort of the basics of kind of Rosen's framework, tells us some ideas about what we observe with respect to the distribution of earnings, gives us kind of two guideposts to look at when we're thinking, is this going to be a context in which superstars are going to emerge as opposed to other types of employment contracts? And then let's move now to applications. So let me talk about a couple. We'd like to talk about ourselves. Let me talk about the legal profession. Second, I'm going to talk about CEOs. And then lastly, let me talk about economic inequality more generally. So the legal profession. In the legal profession, we often talk about how certain lawyers are stars or superstars. One often hears that. I think there's published lists of superstar lawyers. Are they superstars in the sense that Rosen means? Is it the case where we are going to observe the legal profession go in a direction of superstars? I think there's reason to think yes, but also there's reason to think no. On the side of yes, I think it's the case where, with regard to consumer preferences, with respect to legal talent, there is some imperfect substitution of talent. There's that demand for better performers, especially when the stakes are high. And I think some lawyers, maybe we meet them, maybe they're our classmates, who are distinctively talented at particular parts of the lawyer's job, at negotiating or designing a transaction or advocating before a judge or a jury. And so there is some star quality to that talent. But what about the technology side? Does technology allow the work of lawyers to be duplicated at relatively low cost on a mass scale? And here I think this is the break on the legal profession or other forms of professional service going in this direction of superstars. And I think it's because each individual case, each individual client of the lawyer requires individualized attention. You know, the talented lawyer who does a fantastic job representing client A cannot immediately duplicate that work product for client B, right? That other case is different, and the attorney has to invest a lot of time and energy in that case as well. It's not as easy as just selling another seat at the concert. And so the technology doesn't really permit that easy replication when it comes to professional services. Now, it's true, I think, that we've seen in recent years, you know, an acceleration and maybe even a growing skewness in the distribution of earnings for lawyers. You know, I think that's largely because of the consumer side and the consumer preferences that demand for and the greater rewards to hire talent. But I think the technology provides a break on it. So we're probably not going to see lawyers earning the outsized rewards that, you know, famous musical performers earn. You know, Rosen also gives the example of the dentist, the really talented dentist who can spread himself thinly across only so many patients before we decide that really maybe we'd be better off getting a less talented but more focused dentist. So is there anything, just, you know, to think about these ideas and turn them over, is there anything that professional service providers can do when they have incredibly talented members to try to capture something like those superstar rewards? Are there things that we can do in the structuring of work that will allow some of those rewards to be realized? I mean, one thing could just be to charge a higher price. That will deter some potential purchasers. They'll seek other less talented service providers. This may also have the additional implication of pushing the most difficult or the highest value cases, or the cases where the talent of the lawyer will have its greatest impact, to the most talented lawyers. It would facilitate the sorting of cases across lawyers or doctors. That's one thing we could do. Another would be simply to have, you know, a waiting list. I think maybe in some parts of the medical profession we see this. So rather than using price to sort potential customers, instead use just time, right? And some will eventually find other service providers. Another thing that could be done would be to specialize, really to only take certain kinds of cases that are presumably the best match for the lawyer's specific talent, and sort only according to those criteria. So there's those, which is about kind of winnowing down how many clients will be served. But another thing that one could do to expand the number of people the number of customers, to expand the size of the audience that the talented service provider could do, would be to, as they say in law firms, to utilize leverage. And so this is to put the star performer at the top of a hierarchy, and underneath the star to have other junior partners or associate lawyers do support their work. And we could imagine that this would facilitate it in two ways. So one is that the star attorney can, you know, perform only exactly those tasks that are best suited and generate the highest returns to their talents. Let the other attorneys in the team handle everything else, right? This would facilitate the division of labor. Another reason is that by having all of these other attorneys working under the direction of the most talented attorney, their own productivity could be increased. That the talented attorney could expand the productivity and the value of the work of all of those others working under them at their direction. And so we often hear, you know, much discussion about what's the right level of leverage in a law firm. Is it too much? Are clients willing to pay for some of the more junior attorneys working under the direction of the attorney star? I think, you know, Rosen's model gives us some insight into why we see firms taking this approach, and maybe some comfort in understanding that it's really an appropriate structure. It's interesting, I think, also that, whether or not other professional service providers adopt the same approach. So now that's one of what we might think about lawyers and it's their connection or lack of connection to superstars. Let's talk about CEOs. Now, Rosen focuses mostly on, sports performers, musical performers, artists, but he mentions in passing that something about the nature of the services rendered affecting the likelihood of success of the scaling of rewards. And one example that he mentions just in passing is business executives. And here the idea is very much like what I just described with regard to having attorneys work in a firm. The idea that through an organizational hierarchy, a very talented manager at the top could improve the performance of all of the members of the organization, that the skill of the manager at the top would percolate through the hierarchy and improve the value of the whole enterprise. And he mentions this just in passing, and it's an idea that's been picked up by a lot of subsequent scholars. And so it's worth our thinking about just for a minute. Notice the shift here that's occurring. And the shift is really on the side of how we think about production occurs. The preferences on the demand side seem largely the same. There's still that imperfect substitution. We still want the most talented person. We're willing to pay a premium for the most talented person. But what has changed is the assumption about the technology. How do we distribute the talents of this very talented person? And it's not about duplicating them at minimal cost. Really, it's about building underneath them a structure of other workers and other employees whose efforts and whose work will be complementary with the skill of this manager or the CEO. And the CEO talent makes all of them more productive. So the scale effects here happen through the size of the organization and the reach of the organization rather than the size of a performer's audience. So, okay, so then how does this connect to what we're concerned about with regard to CEOs? Well, I think as you may all know, really in past decade and a little bit longer, there's been a really vigorous debate within the academy and the general public, among lawyers and economists, about CEO pay. Is it excessive? Is large pay among executives accelerating? Is the pay of executives in the United States different from that of other countries? And as lawyers, we have particular concerns about this. We're particularly concerned, are shareholders effectively having value expropriated from them and given to the CEO? Is the board of directors meeting its fiduciary duties to provide managerial talent at a sensible cost, right? And so there's a large debate on this, and a number of ideas have been advanced. A number of them include things such as, concern about norms about what CEO pay having been eroded over time, and now a sense of anything goes, a concern about, reliance on stock options and whether the board can actually appreciate and understand what level of compensation is being given in that form. And so a number of scholars have picked up on Rosen's ideas and tried to apply it to see if it offers any insights into this debate. So I'll mention just one sort of foray in this debate, and that is the two economists came together, Javier Gabay and Augustine Landier, and they developed a kind of superstar model of the CEO. And here, what the main takeaway which they have is that there's competition for CEO talent, and that should push the most talented CEOs to managing the largest firms. And then that generates two implications. One is that the CEO pay should be increasing in the size of the firm, right? And so from that, they draw out kind of empirical predictions about what the relationship between CEO pay and the and the size of the firm is. Those should be proportional to each other. They then develop a series of elaborate empirical tests to test that, and they find evidence that supports this superstar theory of CEOs. And of course, as you can imagine, their work has been criticized by others. But it also, I think, provides us kind of an important insight for how we should think about this debate over CEO pay. I think a lot of the debate of CEO pay has been focused on kind of an agency model, right? A concern that, oh, are CEOs being paid in the manner in which they're paid in order to fix agency problems, right? In order to incentivize the CEO properly. But notice that the Rosen framework gives us a slightly different way of thinking about it. It's not necessarily about an agency problem, but it's really about matching the most talented CEOs to the largest organizations where they can generate the largest benefits. And it's about making sure that you're getting the most talented CEOs in a position where they can expand the greatest value of all the workers, generate those complementarities with other workers. And so as we think about a variety of legal reforms or legal interventions on regard to CEO pay, I think those implications ought to be thought about, as well as the more familiar ideas about agency costs. So let me ask, let me go to my last thought and last presentation about the implications of CEOs. And that is with respect to superstars and the economy. And here, this is probably, I think, probably the most controversial implication of Rosen's approach and the application of Rosen's ideas. So, of course, in recent years, there's been a lot of attention to income inequality. We've seen, I think probably the public debate on this really accelerated with the publication of Thomas Piketty's book a few years ago on capital. A number of economists now study this and have made really big contributions about documenting and contesting the growth of income and wealth inequality. And then a whole host of different theories have been advanced about what would explain the growth of income inequality. Some people point to tax policies beginning in the Reagan era. Some people investigate whether unions and the decline of unions has had an impact. Others investigate what the impact of minimum wage is, or what the impact of increased immigration or increased foreign trade is. Probably one of the biggest areas of investigation is the idea of skill-based technological change. And here the idea is that the technologies in the economy have changed in a way that favor more educated, more skilled workers. It's made them more productive, and therefore there's greater demand for them. And other workers who have less skill, demand for their services has fallen. And again, there's a large literature investigating this. The superstar idea is, I think, a sort of one version of this kind of skill-based hypothesis. It's this idea that there's highly talented people and they're able to perform on a very wide scale, and technological change has expanded their ability to perform on this wide scale and to apply their talent to a larger set of resources and reach a larger audience of people. And, we can, when we think about technological innovations in recent years, we can understand, why this hypothesis has a certain degree of plausibility to it. So again, a number of people have investigated this and tried to see if there's any plausibility to this, if there's any evidence to this. Our own Professor Steve Kaplan in the Booth School has, with co-authors, looked at how have the composition of the top 1% earning people in the economy, how has that changed over time? And they advanced the hypothesis that if there's something to this superstar theory, then what one should see is that those people in the top 1% of earners shouldn't be coming from inherited wealth. They should be earning their wealth, applying their talents. And then moreover, they should be generating large returns and large earnings in those industries which have the greatest capacity for this technological reach and this technological spread. And so what they find is that, in fact, that the wealthiest Americans are not, they're less likely in recent years to have inherited their wealth, and they're more likely to have obtained education when they were young and then worked in these industries that are highly scalable: technology, finance, and mass retail. And so they advance this as an argument, right, to say there's something to this Rosen idea of superstars and technological change. And therefore, where we started, back with Rosen's publication back in 1981, thinking about, opera singers, in fact, helps us explain what we're seeing in terms of large trends in the economy generally. So, all right, so now I've spoken for a good long time. Let me stop here and invite questions from the audience. So please, as you know how to do, please use your blue hand, and I'm happy to entertain questions. And if you don't have questions, I'm happy to call on people too. All right, Professor Levmore.
Well, why don't you think that superstar law schools charge 20 times the price of their competitors?
Why don't they?
Yeah. I mean, it should be the same idea. It should be applicable to firms.
Mm-hmm.
And it could be scalable. I mean, Chicago could have 5,000 students, and you could teach, 1,000 a class. So it's surprising that the best law schools charge the same as mediocre law schools.
I do. I think that's puzzling. But to the second part of your question as to why we don't have 5,000 students, that I think seems, I think it's a little bit easier to answer that question, in the sense that I think that the quality of the education would start to degrade, right, at that point, right? Teaching so many, there is really something about being in a classroom with an instructor that I think is really different. I mean, it's related to, I think, a question and a puzzle that a lot of people have wondered about in recent years, which is, especially when the internet came on, there was all these predictions that education, whether legal education or college education, would be replaced by MOOCs, that we would all move online, and that we would find that there are these superstar teachers who are incredibly talented at conveying information and teaching, and that then they would teach these MOOCs with thousands of participants, and they would put universities and colleges out of business. But now we're like 20, 25 years beyond that, and it hasn't happened yet. And I think one of the really interesting questions is, why hasn't that happened yet? And I think there is really something about being in a classroom with individuals and being able to engage with them, and the instructor able to calibrate their instruction to the audience, as well as the audience being able to ask questions usually in real time. That facilitates their learning in a way that in a MOOC it couldn't. But then I also think that there are other benefits beyond the immediate classroom experience that universities and law schools provide. And that is, a lot of the learning occurs through the other students, right? Through our Socratic dialogue, so much emerges from what the responses of the students are. I've often said to students, that as a faculty member, it's really my job in a Socratic class, to ask questions. And most of the learning is done through the responses that the students give. And so having a cohort of amazing fellow students, I think, really facilitates that, as well as all the learning that goes on outside of the classroom, right? And those things, I think, are why we don't scale up completely within law schools. And why, there's really something to this, where the technology of effective education at the college level, and I think at the level of professional schools, limits it. It's not easily replicable. It's not the same thing as just going and hearing a concert. Right. So now I'm getting worried that like there aren't any questions. And well, and what will happen, and I will say if there are no questions, is that the length of my answers will continue to expand, such that we will see convexity in the length of my answers. All right, so let me call on Ed.
Thank you, Miles. I found this, excuse me, I found this talk really interesting, and Professor Leavenworth's question was interesting because I know last quarter he gave a talk about the size of organizations. So you had mentioned how law firms and potentially companies can support superstar CEOs and superstar lawyers, with basically having, support staff underneath them that are supporting their work. And I guess, you maybe see this at the university level. You might have a superstar professor that has, 10 graduate students or something underneath them. And that less engagement that you might have because you have additional students, you can kind of make up for with the graduate students and TAs getting to interact with them in your section. Why can't law schools do this? Why can't you have a professor that has, a couple of, not graduate students, but, kind of support students to basically scale up and increasing enrollment?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think I have two hypotheses I can advance. So one is that the teaching is a little bit like Rosen's example of the dentist. There's some point at which the dentist just gets spread too thin, right? The dentist can be supported by a whole bunch of dental assistants that can do a lot of the kind of prep work and other pieces, and the dentist can step in and do just, the highest value work. But there's some point at which they're going to be spread too thin, right? The other part of this is one where really what we're looking for is a direct kind of experience, right? That really what we're looking for is a direct engagement in which people can learn from one another. And it's unlike, the large organization, right? In many ways, already in legal education, we are more scaled, I think, than a lot of other areas of higher education, because we do use that Socratic method. In effect, in using that Socratic method, we are, as I described before, we're enlisting the students in the educational process, which is really different than a lot of other types of education in which it's straight lecture, right? And so when it's straight lecture, you can have someone there who, either speaks directly into a screen, but it's very passive learning, and we think less effective. Or you could have a smaller sort of Oxford, Cambridge style small reading group, but then by definition, it's very small. And I think with Socratic education, it's an effort to strike the balance between the two of them, right? It's got to be it's a larger group, but it's also one that it's sufficiently small such that there is engagement. If there were 1,000 students in the room, like there wouldn't be an opportunity to call on people, not even once in a term. And so I think through legal education, we've maybe not by design, but we have arrived at something with a really effective scaling. Thanks for the question. Angela.
Hi, Dean Miles. So as someone from a performance background, I'm struck with this opera singer hypothetical and thinking about it that way. And I'm drawn towards this idea of comparing when you have, say, your superstar opera singer and you're planning an event for them, and then you can put a chorus behind them and it's all just no names. Beginner, amateur singers even can work, but you can still draw revenue that way. As opposed to when you're programming, say, a quartet or a small group. And you might have people who, yes, one is a little bit more talented than the other or is singing slightly better, but you might have more equal divisions of how they're being paid. And perhaps because it is more of a collaborative task being performed than here is the star and the stage and then here is their backup. how would that translate into other fields? And do we think that that does translate based on if it is a task that is more evenly divided in the work, even though there is, say, a superstar in that team, than a task where you have the lead and then, say, your supporting characters?
Yeah, thanks, Angela. It's a great question. I mean, it's interesting, right? Because even within musical performance, we see groups that emerge kind of as a star group, right? So in classical music, there'll be star quartets and well-known quartets, or in popular music, there'll be a famous band, right? And so it doesn't have to be just one performer. And of course, what's so interesting is that, I mean, I suppose in many ways, like there's whole television shows about this. Like when the contributions of the members of the group become disproportionate and one person seems to pull away almost as kind of the star soloist, right? Then the tensions and the drama emerge, right? As to who then should reap the outside rewards. And we often see that in, for example, in popular music, people will break off from their group and go have their solo career because they realize they can reap more of the outsized rewards. And it's interesting too, when we think about a larger organization and we think about really what's being delivered is more of a team effort, right? And how are the different contributions divided up? I think many times, that in certain areas of the entertainment industry, and I'll defer to your superior knowledge of this area, but I think in many ways, oftentimes what we see, whether it's a group or an individual, behind them is a whole team of people supporting them, right? And really they are sort of the beginning. And what we don't see, we see, and what, the Rosen's analysis of superstars responds to is this idea of, oh, here's the pay of this one performer. But really that pay and that revenue might be divided up among a group of other people who are helping with the advancement and the marketing of this person. But clearly that person, if we were able to see behind what those contracts are and how that is divided up, there's clearly something special about that performer. They have some special quality really that helps deliver kind of what it is. Why does their performance stand out from others? There's some special quality and special talent that we think would probably justify their capturing the lion's share of the financial rewards. Right, thank you. Alex Green.
Hi, Dean Miles. Thank you for giving this talk. I'm not sure if I'll be able to ask my question quite right, so please excuse me if I don't use all the right words. But one topic that's come up in my reading about superstar economics is the idea of, like, when do you need a superstar versus when do you need someone who's just good enough, right? Above a threshold of good enough. And one example that has been resonant for me is, what kind of doctor do we want in our health system? Do we want a system where we have, what I really want is the best doctor available, or do I really just want a doctor who's good enough to get done for me what I need to get done? And I'm not sure if there's a difference between the marginal benefit to the individual who's soliciting the doctor versus the marginal benefit to society or something like that. And so I'm wondering if you could maybe discuss that a little bit. And I think about this most often actually with respect to firms. I wonder if it's been made clear whether a superstar CEO is really a superstar, or whether what you really want is just a good enough CEO. But because we have a market for CEOs where people assume you need to pay, where they might not really have very good information about whether a superstar CEO is actually a superstar, I'm wondering how that applies, and whether there's good data on the effects of elite CEOs, and whether there are implications for what sort of rules we want to create for a market that might sort of limit either superstar quasi-monopoly power, if that's the right word generally, or help mitigate the effects of sort of like a false superstar, or like a superstar in an environment where there actually aren't superstars. Thanks.
Thanks, Alex. That's a really interesting question. And I think a very hard question to answer. I mean, so I would suggest there are a couple of dimensions of this. So one is whether we think that a superstar market is in some sense wasteful, are there alternative mechanisms through which we could see the same level or nearly the same level of talent emerge with less investment and less energy being put into it? And so sometimes in the, particularly in the performing arts, it's remarked upon that, the phenomenon of the struggling artist, the starving artist, the people who accept less than what they could, they're accepting a kind of lower compensation that they could receive in an alternative in order to pursue this possibility of getting these outside rewards. And in many ways, I think what they're doing in that context is they're doing what you also mentioned, which is we're going through a learning process through which we're finding out of what level of talent that they have, right? And they're learning it, we're learning it, and as a result, one has a different sort of experience with it. I think many of the artists that we see that we could go, like if we go to a local club to hear a performer, we'll probably pay less than if we went to hear an established known performer that we know is going to be high quality. And so in many ways, when we think about what's going on with CEOs, do we have the same set of challenges? And do we have the same set of questions as we think about, as we look across the market for executives? Are there some that we think are not really, we don't know what their quality is, we don't know what their talents are, and how do we learn it? I think in many ways what we've got is a system, and this is sort of unstated in much of the current thinking about superstar CEOs, is what is the process through which CEOs are found, right? I think most of these models are thinking about a CEO hopping from a smaller company to a larger company. But I think, in fact, we know that a lot of CEOs emerge from within the ranks of the organization, right? They're a vice president of finance, or they're the controller, they're something else. And they then move up to the CEO position. And that might be a way for the organization to internally learn something about what's the quality of this person as a manager and have more confidence in it. And so that's sort of, I think, a really promising, if people are interested in superstar markets, a really promising avenue that hasn't really been intellectually explored. And so your question is a great one and really hits on it. I would say also one of the things that we don't understand very well about superstars is how they relate to one of the very frequently mentioned legal policy levers with respect to CEO compensation, which is taxation, right? I think there's a lot of effort or a natural reaction on the part of people when they see what CEOs are paid to say, oh, if we're concerned about income inequality, they ought to be taxed more. And I think the CEO framework gives us a way to think about what are the implications of that for the allocation of talent? And is that another dimension that we should think about when we're trying to set optimal policy in this area? And I think that has not been very deeply explored either, and is a great avenue for more thinking. I see that we've got another question, but I encourage others to raise their hand. Matthew.
Okay. Hi, yeah, also thanks for the talk today. I wanted to kind of just tag on two things that maybe you've touched on a little bit already, but additional elements to the whether someone becomes a superstar or not. The first one is fame. So I think this whole idea kind of depends on that, first of all, that there's actually a real difference between talent at the very top, and second of all, that the people who are consuming can actually distinguish that difference in talent. So I have to know that this top painter or singer or whatever is really better than the next best person. And then I, as the audience member, have to be able to figure that out. And so maybe in situations where either that difference isn't real and like people might disagree with me, but I'm thinking about like modern painting or something, maybe it's really, really hard to tell if this painter is really better than this other painter. Or I can, but the difference is very small. Maybe, and I can't tell it. Maybe I, as a consumer, would use just fame as a proxy, and so the superstars are people who just by maybe random chance or random elements become the most famous. And then the second is, I don't know if this is really related, but like people seem to value authenticity, and what I'm thinking of is like I might gain the same utility from actual Da Vinci painting as from a reproduction of a Da Vinci painting. but I would pay way more for the authentic painting. And maybe sometimes people pay way more for those like authentic experiences rather than ones you could actually reproduce in an inauthentic way. So yeah, I wonder like if you think that ties into this at all.
Sure. Thank you, Matthew, for that question. Let me think about fame from kind of two different perspectives. So one is within the idea of the superstar. The superstar, in order to capture as much of the market as they could possibly, in order to have as wide an audience as they possibly can, could be very interested in trying to advance their fame. Right? So this would make sense as to why then so many people who are in the entertainment industry put themselves forward in so many different platforms, right? They might be a television star, but they also have an Instagram feed and a Twitter feed and so forth. They're trying to draw in as much audience as possible. And those kinds of things, fame helps in that way, right? So many, it used to be the case, I think, in the old days of Hollywood, that so much of the tabloid press was really engineered, right? And it was a way to try to generate more fame and manage fame with an eye towards box office revenue. The other kind of piece of your question about fame is, could we imagine that, and particularly about whether or not we can distinguish the very talented from the least talented, and to take a version of this to the extreme. Could we have people who become the most famous, that capture most of the market, and they're not the most talented, right? There may be no more talented than someone we would pull at random. And so some people have wondered if that's the case. Could that happen? And under what circumstances could that happen? And so there are some things that might draw us in that direction. So it could be that one of the things that we really like about consuming entertainment is we like consuming it in tandem with other people. We like being able to talk to people about, we saw this movie or we saw this performance, and talking about it and analyzing it with others. And that kind of network effect, or maybe we'll call it a fame, would be advanced even independent of the quality of the performance. We just want a kind of shared experience. And so one could wonder whether or not there's a kind of snowball effect, right, that just gets generated. Now, I don't know. I mean, I think we can all think of various performers and think, why are they a star? They don't seem to have any talent. And it seems to be, evidence in favor of these sort of snowball or network theories. But I also think that when we look across the main, set of performers, we can identify there is something there. There is some talent there. So I'm not willing to go all the way to the extreme and say that there's no talent element in it. But also, I think your point about what if we can't distinguish between the very top performers and not. And I think it's true that for certain areas of the arts, our ability to appreciate it requires some investment on our part, right? If we want to understand modern painting, we're probably going to learn a lot about it. If we really want to understand certain parts of classical music, we've got to learn something about it. And our enjoyment of it depends upon our past knowledge and our past investment of understanding in it. And I think that's true. And I also think that once we are kind of within a community, that task of discerning who is the most talented is actually really enjoyable. To take like a trivial example, why are there all these singing competition shows on TV? Look, it's clearly a lot of fun to be able to compare one singer to another, right? And that, I think, becomes itself its own form of consumption and entertainment. Or think about sports. I mean, how many sports fans, no matter what the sport, want to argue about who is the GOAT, like who is the greatest, right? And we love talking about it. We want to compare the statistics and the win rates and who had the most scores and the most assists, whatever the sport. And that itself becomes kind of a consumption good, right? And having people who are famous and developing knowledge about the histories of these different performers and these contributes to our understanding of it. And so I think that's that I think is part of it as well, is that it's an investment in the development of those kinds of skill. And that's all contributes to what we might call fame. Thanks for the question, Matthew. Let me go to Benjamin.
Thanks, Dean Miles. So there was an article in the Financial Times a few years ago called "The Dawn of the Superstar Lawyer," about how there's this sort of crop of younger, aggressive firms, like Kirkland, poaching basically partners from the older, more established firms with just exorbitantly high salaries. And I'm wondering what you think is like the equilibrium of this whole situation, in a world where it seems like lawyers are increasingly like less loyal to their firms, and then clients aren't really loyal to a firm, they're loyal to a particular lawyer.
Yeah, thank you. A great question. I mean, I guess my first reaction is just to hope that I'll have to go look up the article that you mentioned. Just my immediate hope is that the superstar lawyers on whom Don is arriving are all Chicago graduates. But once we move beyond that, I would say, where I think that is coming from a place where there is a greater attention to having a really high level of talent that can earn and generate outsized rewards, right? And so it's that preference for the really talented lawyer when the stakes are high, right? As the economy gets bigger, as different types of transactions and larger transactions happen, the benefit from having someone who's very, very talented gets higher. And so as a result, one would expect that then it's possible that then what one would see would be that financial rewards would overcome loyalty to an institution, right? And that would be something that that could emerge. So it seems consistent to me with the kind of superstar theory. Ben, is that responsive to your question?
Yeah, no, I think it is. I think I'm interested in sort of the end state. Where like how do the old line firms like Cravath that have been doing this for hundreds of years and they insist on lockstep, how are they going to kind of resist the urge to ultimately just start paying out massive checks to partners if those partners just get up and go to a rival?
Yeah, no, I think you're right. I think you identify it's going to be very hard for them to do that. I think we have seen in recent decades more firms abandon lockstep in order for a more skewed payment schemes. And what I think one would then wonder is, to the extent to which there are some firms that can survive and maintain a lockstep model, what is their kind of position in the market? Is it that there's some other reward to being at that firm that they're able to offer, right? That offsets giving up the more skewed distribution of earnings that one would receive somewhere else. So I see we are down to less than a minute remaining. And I just want to say, I'm really grateful for you all turning out. Thank you for your questions. It's been a real pleasure to talk about these ideas. I hope they inspire you to think about what we can learn about the market for superstars, how it can form and have application for us in law. So thank you all very much for joining us. Have a great afternoon.